This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing the knowledge and study of modern Israel. I am your host, Gilad Halpern, and this interview is being recorded on the premises of the 2018 annual conference of the Association for Israel Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. My guest today is an associate professor of political science at Berkeley, as well as the author and editor of several books, including most recently Religion on the Battlefield, that was published by Cornell University Press in 2016. Professor Ron Hassner, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
So, contrary to what one may think and one actually thought, your book is not about jihad and not about violent acts perpetrated by extremist groups. In fact, it looks at the place of religion in modern warfare, specifically because we perceive wars today as rational, interest-driven, etc. So my question to you is, while you started researching and writing this book, were you surprised by how prevalent religion is in modern warfare?
That's a good question. I was not surprised. I had already written a prior book on the role of religion in conflict, which was called War on Sacred Grounds, and was, for its time, which was not so long after 9/11, a standard text about how we should think about the relationship between religion and conflict. So religion motivates people to fight about things that they wouldn't otherwise fight over. In the case of this first book, it was about holy places. Islam is one of those religions, and it leads people, usually not states, usually individuals or small groups, to commit violent acts, maybe even fanatical acts, that they wouldn't have contemplated had it been for rational material calculations. So Jerusalem is worth a great deal of sacrifice for religious reasons. It has no strategic, topographic, or other value. The same can be said for sacred sites in India or in Saudi Arabia. It was later, when more and more scholars got on the radical Islamic violence train, that it occurred to me that we should look at religion not just as a motivator of violence, but also as a constraint on violence. That we should look at religion not just as a source of ideas, but also a source of practices, by which I mean dumbed down things people do with their bodies and their hands, not just their brains. And that we shouldn't just look at Islam. And we shouldn't just look at radical non-state actors. We should also look at the normal day-to-day religious behaviors of state actors. So American soldiers, what are their religious practices? Might those shape how they behave on the battlefield?
But what does it say about the premise of modern politics, which is the separation between church and state? And in this regard, war is part of the state. The church should be absent from.
So in the scholarship, the attitude has been, we need to keep religion as separate from war making as possible. And when religion interferes in war making, things go off the equilibrium path. Strange things happen in both directions. Usually bad things. Soldiers who ought to be fighting for straightforward goals start behaving erratically, make unnecessary sacrifices, take unnecessary risks, fight for things that they shouldn't be fighting for. But also in the other direction, that religion often has this sort of magical, mystical constraining effect, which spurs people onto a sort of benevolence, so that you have the religious messenger of goodwill appearing on the battlefield trying to stop combatants from fighting. Both of those struck me as very, very extreme cases and very much out of line with what we actually see when we look at how militaries run their affairs. So before I wrote this book, Religion on the Battlefield, I edited a volume that was sort of designed to gather empirical information for this book. I asked colleagues around the world about how religion affects the behavior of their militaries. And I didn't go to sort of the obvious contenders, Iran and Israel, though I did. I went to some of the least expected cases. I asked experts in the Canadian military, in the Japanese military, in the British and American militaries. How does religion affect the behavior of your soldiers? And I don't just mean while they fight. I mean as they train. I mean as they are selected into the army. So every military skews the demographics of the state. No military is a perfect representation of the demographics of the society that it is designed to protect. So are the soldiers in the military more or less pious? Do they engage in different religious practices than society at large? Do you have chaplains? Are there military rabbis or military imams? How do you protect the religious freedom of soldiers? What role do religious symbols play when soldiers are fighting or preparing to fight or recovering from fighting? And the results were absolutely fascinating. It turned out that there was not a single military in the world in which religion was not an issue of great contention. There were constitutional struggles, there were ethical struggles, there were personal struggles, and there was not one military in the world in which these issues were resolved at an equilibrium level so that everybody was happy. The issues were constantly in flux and were constantly being argued over. If you think about the case of Israel, if you think about the case of Turkey, those are sort of clear examples in which there's a constant pull and push about what role religion should play.
So does this tension emanate really from the fact that religion is perhaps more at the individual level, at the grassroots level of the soldiers themselves and how they interpret their role as taking part in the military endeavor, as opposed to what comes from above that should, going back to my previous questions, should be separate, should separate religion from a military or political strategy?
In no military I know of are the issues completely separate. The tension emanates often from simple constitutional issues. So the U.S. Constitution, for example, provides for religious freedoms of American citizens. They have the right to worship. And it cannot be that that right disappears when you put on a uniform to defend the United States of America. On the contrary, it would seem that exactly under these conditions, Uncle Sam
makes you a government agent.
Uncle Sam would want to assure that you can worship freely. And yet at the same time, the U.S. Constitution envisions a certain separation of church and state. So you cannot send American soldiers into battle without providing them with sacred scriptures, without providing them with the chaplains they need, without providing them with the freedom to have hours of prayer. Should the U.S. taxpayer pay for these things? The U.S. military and the U.S. courts have decided that the answer is yes. Should the U.S. taxpayer pay for kosher meals? The decision was yes. Should the United States provide sacramental wine to Christian and Jewish soldiers serving with U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia? There's an interesting question. The answer is yes, but the writing on the bottles should disguise the fact that this is actually alcohol. Should American soldiers be allowed to proselytize while in Muslim countries? The answer is clearly no. So these issues are very, very complicated, and there's a pull and push from both directions, by which I mean what happens in the military is often a concentrated, highlighted microcosm of struggles that are happening in societies at large. But what happens in the military then also spills back into society because, and this is basic civil-military relations 101, citizens have figured out around the world, especially in democracies, that if they want to establish equal rights, including religious rights, they have to start in the military. This is why the struggles for gay rights in the United States, or the struggles for minority rights in the United States, be they women, be they African American, be they people of color, be they Jews, have often started in the military.
Why is that? What makes the military a readily available arena for these issues?
It's seen, I think, as a sphere of hyper-nationalism and hyper-patriotism. These must be people, it's not always true, but it's sort of an assumption, these must be people who are the best of our country and are fighting for the things we value most. They are representatives of our government in uniform. They are where the rubber hits the road. So how can we expect, for example, in World War II, African Americans to fight for this country and to sacrifice their lives for this country, but not then give them equal voting rights? How can we expect gays in the U.S. military to hide their sexual identity and yet at the same time serve alongside others proudly and represent us? That is then a fortiori true with religion. As the United States and Israel and all these other countries I've mentioned, and it's hard to think of a country in the world where that's not the case, as these countries grapple with their religious identity, those problems appear in a hyper-concentrated form in the military. They make headlines in the newspapers, and society then has to grapple with them. Here's an easy example. I don't know, and you probably don't either, how often in Israeli public events men walk out when women start singing. How would we know this? There's really no good way to know. But we certainly know when it happens in the Israeli military because it makes headlines. And it becomes a policy issue that we have to decide on as a society.
But that is because in Israel, the military is perceived, and in many cases is, a very central public arena where people from all backgrounds meet, in many cases but not necessarily out of their own will. In America, it's slightly different. In Europe, it's even less. I mean, the place of the military in society is incredibly marginal in Europe. How does this skew your analysis?
So in Europe, I'd say in Europe it is more marginal, and you find fewer issues of contention or other kinds of issues of contention. So it's not always a constitutional conflict. In Europe, the conflicts are often less constitutional. They're often more ethical or moral. So deriving ethics and morals from religion, what role should my military play in peacekeeping operations? How should my military intervene or not intervene to prevent genocide or to support refugees coming in from other countries? So it's a slightly different role for religion. The issue that Europeans have increasingly is...
Not so much of religion in the military, but what you said earlier about the fact that what happens in the military mirrors larger trends in society. How do you see that gap?
So sometimes, as in militaries that play a very dominant role in society, so that relates to what we just said, other militaries rule over society. So you have authoritarian military regimes. If you take the case for Iran, for example, so there the military sets an example for the rest of society. The military is used to both set ground rules and oppress elements in society that don't follow the government example. So Iranian officers and Iranian soldiers are expected to attend public prayers in mosques. Those are then screened and they're available to the public. And so the military at prayer becomes a symbol of the regime and its control. In Turkey, you get the opposite story, where the military is equally important, not as a representative society, but as a counterbalance to Islamist forces in society. There, the military acts as a check. And what that means is, or has meant, I'd say, before Erdogan became Sultan Pasha, it meant that the military was often purged of religious elements as a warning to society and as a warning to the government. So routinely, in the 1990s and the 2000s, the Turkish military fired officers who were seen praying in public or whose wives were seen wearing veils in public. These people were summarily dismissed from office as a way for the military to say, here's what we stand for, Kemalist ideology, and we will take action against governments that stray from our line. And in yet other examples, Japan is an interesting case because it doesn't really have an official military. It's called the Japanese Self-Defense Force. Here's a case where tensions over religious practices in the military represent hidden issues that society doesn't really want to deal with. Japan has an even stricter separation of church and state than the United States. But no Japanese soldier in his right mind would board a military vehicle that has not undergone a religious cleansing, a religious purification from evil spirits. But in the Japanese military, unlike most militaries you know, the government refuses to fund religious services. There are no chaplains in the Japanese self-defense forces. There is no provision of religious services. So what ends up happening is that the military surreptitiously obtains these services under the table. And part of what that edited volume did was expose how Japanese officers do attend religious ceremonies, smuggle religious clerics into their army bases, place amulets and altars in their airplanes and boats to make them safe for combat. So it sort of highlights a certain hypocrisy in society. But again, all that is from the edited volume. Most of these chapters were not chapters I wrote. The question for this book, Religion on the Battlefield, was, who cares? Does this actually matter for tactics and strategy? When push comes to shove and these militaries engage in fighting, does it matter that you have an amulet on your helicopter? Does it matter that your American GI underwent, baptism in Iraq prior to engaging in battle? That's the agenda for this last book.
So the question is whether the bottom line of your analysis is that we in the so-called secular West, in liberal democracies where there's a certain degree of separation between church and state, we are more religious than we'd like to believe about ourselves. And the military is just a good example to make that claim.
I think that's exactly right. And the way separation of church and state is understood in modern democracies is a Protestant model. And the notion of separation of church and state is primarily a legal separation and an ideological separation. What my research is interested in is less the realm of ideas and more the realm of practice. I have a very hard time explaining this to readers who are secular or modern Protestant. I'm not sure there's a difference between the two. I have a much easier time explaining this to Mormons, Catholics, Muslims, Jews, who understand that their religion is not only about ideas, but has a lot to do with the body and social structure.
So please explain it now to our listeners.
So does Jewish religion, here's a provocative question, does the Jewish religion motivate Israeli soldiers? It certainly doesn't motivate the Israeli government in its pursuit of wars. Some argue that it does, and it's a really, really big stretch to argue that Jewish ideology has motivated the pursuit of war in 1948, 1967, 1973. Policy regarding territories is a different issue. But even though official Jewish ideology may not motivate official policy, it is the fact that many Jewish soldiers keep kosher. Many Jewish soldiers observe the Sabbath. Many Jewish soldiers fast on Yom Kippur. Many Jewish soldiers have unique relationship with rabbis that influence their individual decision-making, that influence decision-making at the unit level, that influence commanders and how commanders think about what it means to be an enemy, what it means to be a victim, what it means to be a prisoner, what it means to surrender, what good training and bad training and discipline is at all these different levels. So here's an obvious, simple, straightforward example, the easiest example I can think of. If you want to attack a Jewish military and catch it off guard, Yom Kippur is a good day to do that. This is not true for a Chinese military, and it's not true for an American military, and it's not true for the Iranian military. It is unique to the Jewish military that attacking it on Yom Kippur leads to different effects than attacking it at other times of the day. And this has nothing to do with religious belief. It has nothing to do with confessing sin or feeling guilt or theological thoughts about the books of life and the book of death. It has to do with religious practice. How hungry am I? How many of my soldiers are at home? How focused am I? It turns out, and this does not require a great deal of archival research, that the Egyptians thought long and hard about these issues when they prepared the attack in 1973. This was part of their explicit deliberation. So there's a very straightforward example.
You do say that your analysis goes beyond the fact that religions cause war and how religion shapes the progression and outcome of wars. But what about how do you demarcate religion? When does it spill over to other realms. I'm thinking about, you did say about the wars of Israel, that's not really about the Jewish religion, but for Israel, Jewish religion often spills into Jewish nationalism. The same for, Hamas, for example. I mean, are they a Palestinian national movement or are they an Islamic jihadist movement? They're a bit of both. And the same goes to Iran. It's an Islamic republic, but then again, its military exploits are perhaps more about expansionism and regional imperialism than about fighting in the name of Prophet Muhammad or whatever. How do you address that issue? Where do you draw the line? Is it possible at all?
It's a very, very thorny issue in the study of religion. So thorny, in fact, that many political scientists, sociologists, people from across fields who study religion have sort of given up on religion as a concept. I don't think that's necessarily a healthy attitude. Religion is very difficult to capture and delineate, no more difficult to capture and delineate than nationalism or culture or gender or any other form of identity. So I do what I advise my students to do. I offer a definition in the first few pages of the book. This is how I think about religion. Take it or leave it. It's a pretty straightforward definition. In the day-to-day reality of thinking about religion, most people actually understand what you mean when you say the word. If I say, my uncle discovered religion last year, oh no, everybody understands what I mean. Although it may matter whether my uncle is, Mormon or Greek Orthodox. So I don't think that problem stands in the way of research. You define how you see religion. I also define early on in the book the aspects of religious practice that I'm interested in looking at. Specifically, I'm interested in sacred time, sacred space, sacred authority, and sacred ritual. Often, especially in the realm of civil religion, those things blur with particular forms of nationalism. I should know because the concept of civil religion was really sort of coined on the Berkeley campus in interesting ways, and I'm happy to cross that line back and forth. But really, I'm interested in straightforward questions like, how do religious holy days, which in some places are also considered national holy days, how do they affect preparations for war and the execution of war? How do holy places, churches, temples, mosques, which can also have a national and cultural value, but which are first and foremost sacred places, how do they affect the conduct of war? How do priests, imams, rabbis, clerics who are on the battlefield, do they motivate soldiers? Do they constrain soldiers? And then the last question is a question sort of about individual level superstitions and practices. The small beliefs about miracles and lucky charms and rituals that soldiers have always and will always carry with them into battle. Do they matter? How do they manifest?
So it's not really about what religion is. It's really exactly how it manifests itself.
Correct.
As you say. So this is your view of not seeing religion as a set of beliefs, but a set of practices makes it more observable.
I think that's right.
Therefore more analytical for your purposes.
Which isn't to say that Yom Kippur isn't also a national holiday in Israel in certain senses, a cultural holiday in certain senses.
But it doesn't matter that the Israeli soldiers were praying to ask God for forgiveness.
Correct.
What really matters was that the army was practically shut down on the day.
Correct. That, for example, this was a fascinating deliberation that Moshe Dayan participated in, that people weren't listening to the radio. And one of the Israeli deliberations was, should we perhaps have break that tradition in preparation for a potential Egyptian-Syrian offensive and have hourly broadcasts just to have people turn the radio on once an hour. And Moshe Dayan's response was, this would break such a cultural taboo that it would create a sense of panic in Israel. Just the mere notion that one would have to turn the radio on would worry people disproportionately to what he thought the level of preparation should be. Yeah, so they turn out to be pretty simple, straightforward, pragmatic issues. So here's another very simple example. The United States engages in an intensive bombing campaign in Europe. So do the British. The United States is the primary actor responsible for bombing the Germans out of Italy during the Second World War, as the Germans are retreating. One of the charming characteristics of Italy is that it is chock full of Christian sacred places. So here are two Christian armies engaged in war in a third country that has sensitive Christian sites. And the Pope sends a communique to the American President, Roosevelt, requesting that the sacred places in Rome be spared while Rome is being bombed. Now, if you've ever looked closely at a map of Rome, let alone walked the streets of Rome, you understand that bombing Rome without harming churches is like bombing Berkeley without harming hippies. It's a ludicrous notion. So how do you round that square? Did the U.S. military even bother? And the answer is yes, they did. They put tremendous effort into recognizing which churches were more or less important to the Vatican, and into then designing bomb runs that would put their pilots under tremendous risk and actually reduce the chances of hitting targets, but would spare churches. And when they screwed up, despite the tremendous risk that they took, and did hit one church of great significance, the outcry in the world posed a real cost to the American war-making effort.
That's amazing. Professor Ron Hassner, political scientist at UC Berkeley and the author of Religion on the Battlefield, was published by Cornell University Press in 2016. Thank you very much for joining us today.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
And also thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shalem and Julia Brahms, our producers, as well as the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for their generous support. Now we have a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you this. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then, of course, write one. Also, you can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. For just a handful of dollars a month, you've got gifts and perks and other lovely things for you. Check out our archive. It has more than 450 interviews. If you like us here, please like us on Facebook. The Tel Aviv Review podcast Ideas from Israel is the name of our page. And don't forget to follow me and my co-host Dalia Shandlin on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.